There's some powerful gravitational force at work that causes all the traffic to stop around about Mar-a-Lago. And one senses an optimism, high spirits. Even, I think, those who were on the losing side of the election have a certain relief that there was a clear outcome. In this happy place, where the vibe shift feels very real, it's almost bad taste to think of a very different place. But I want you to do that. I want you to think about Vilnius. I want you to think about a city that was once the Jerusalem of the North, the greatest center of Jewish learning and culture in all of Europe. I would guess there are members of this audience with family roots in Lithuania. Put a hand up if you have a connection to. Okay. So, I went there for the first time just a couple of months ago. It's a pretty town. It's an attractive destination, beautiful Baroque architecture. If you didn't know the history, you wouldn't see the ghosts. Vilnius is a city of ghosts. So many people died. And they died as a result of historical forces none of them could control or anticipate. How could they foresee that the Jerusalem of the North would be for a time a Polish city and then would be taken over by Soviet Lithuania and then would be overrun by the Nazis, who set about, with considerable assistance from local Lithuanian militias, massacring all the Jews of Vilnius and nearly all the Jews of Lithuania. No country in the Holocaust suffered a higher percentage of deaths than in Lithuania. As I walked around those streets, past the vanished synagogues, I remembered why I became a historian. Why, despite the fact that I was raised an atheist and recently became, along with my wife Ayan, a Christian, I have devoted a substantial part of my scholarly career to studying the history of your people. Because the tragedy that befell the Jews is the single most horrific event of history. And what makes it so horrific is that ultimately it was perpetrated by the most advanced of European countries. The country, Germany, that had, in the 1920s, the best universities in the world, the most Nobel Prizes of any country, the most advanced industrial and technological economy in Europe. The reason I became a historian was to try to understand the central problem that the Holocaust exemplifies. That not education, not modernity, not great music, not great literature, not great science. None of these things can inoculate us against evil. And the question that I have asked myself repeatedly for the last 6 years is, are we in a new Cold War? Are we in Cold War II? And was that period after 1991 just an interwar period that ended at some point, perhaps as long ago as 2012, certainly sometime after 2016? Now, as I mentioned, I've devoted much of my career to Jewish history. The biography I'm still in the midst of writing of Henry Kissinger is a part of my effort to understand the modern Jewish experience. If anybody could answer the question, are we in Cold War II, it was Henry Kissinger. And so I asked him. And I had the sheer nerve, the chutzpah, to ask him in Beijing in November 2019 at a conference organized by Bloomberg. I had no idea how he would reply. After all, he was a man who had, more than any other Westerner, more than any other American, built the relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China. It's perhaps the achievement that many people most associate with him. Are we, Dr. Kissinger, I asked, in a new Cold War? He gave one of those pregnant pauses before replying. And his reply, I'll never forget, was this. We are in the foothills of a Cold War. In the foothills of a Cold War. What an answer. It's not often that you sort of feel a shiver of historical recognition go down your spine, but I felt it then. And a year later, he, in another interview with someone else, upgraded it to the mountain passes of a Cold War. Shortly before his 100th birthday, I asked him again about that question. And he said to me, the second Cold War will be more dangerous than the first. Now, if anybody was qualified to recognize a Cold War, it was surely Henry Kissinger, who was there at the beginning of the first Cold War and there at the end of it. Two superpowers, ladies and gentlemen. One committed to capitalism and democracy, the other committed to Marxism-Leninism. Ideologically divided, in a technological competition with one another, not only in the field of nuclear weapons, but now also in the field of artificial intelligence, in the field of quantum computing. That, of course, was what Kissinger meant when he said, this is more dangerous because the technologies have become more potent, the weapons more accurate, our capacity for mass destruction even greater than it was in the First Cold War. Two superpowers in an economic competition with one another, and a closer economic competition than it ever was with the Soviet Union. It's not the Cuban Missile Crisis we have to worry about, but the outbreak of a world war. But in some senses, has already commenced. When did World War II begin exactly? In a book called The War of the World, I tried to answer that question. The answer is not September 1939. War had already, for all intents and purposes, begun. It had already begun in China with Japan's incursions into Manchuria and beyond. It had already begun in Spain. It had already begun if you were in Czechoslovakia. The nightmare scenario for us is that World War III is already in some measure underway, and the danger exists that it can escalate as it did in 1939. If that is the case, then it seems to me the urgent imperative for the United States is to re-establish deterrence as soon as is humanly possible. All the talk of de-escalation that has characterized the last nearly 4 years has been, in truth, a self-delusion. It turns out that de-escalation is the functional opposite of deterrence. Peace through strength. That is the President-elect on the phone. Please tell him I'm very busy. If one thinks in these terms about our time, then the significance of October 7th changes. To me, as soon as I saw the images that came out of Israel on that grim day, it was clear what was intended. October 7th was a trailer for a second Holocaust.